tonight. My name is Tiff Beatty. I'm Associate Director at the National Public Housing Museum. We have some slides, you all. If you're new to us, you'll learn a lot just by watching these slides. We'll also play them again at the end, and I'll be popping in and out just to share a bit about the museum. But thanks so much for being here. We're really excited about this book launch, book party for Design and Solidarity. You guys give it up for the book. And really amazing contributors that are here that you're going to hear from, as well as our booksellers, Haymarket. Thank you all, Julie, Eric, Dylan. So the book is on sale tonight. It's $25. You can get it signed, take it home with you tonight. So we encourage you to do that. It's also going to be available a couple other places after this, which I'll share with you all later on in the program. But really just here to welcome you all. Thank some other partners that we have tonight. We have the Social Justice Initiative from the University of Illinois in the house. All the work you all do, as well as the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. So it truly does take a village. We also have, not here with us tonight, but they have a ton of programs going on this week. We want to shout out the Graham Foundation for making the book possible, supporting the book itself to be published, as well as, I think there was at least one other, the Corner Store Co-op, which I'm going to tell you all more about a little bit later, which is the official bookseller for the museum. And we'll be selling some merch connected to this book as well. So give it up for the Corner Store Co-op. Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping. So tonight's conversation will run until 7:30, and then as I mentioned, we'll have a book signing and also a reception. So we want to invite you all to stay, have some food, talk to each other, talk to our contributors to the book, and just get to know each other and celebrate and have fun. We'll turn the house music up a little bit more at the end so we can move the chairs out of the way and dance a little bit, or however you all are feeling. It's a beautiful day in Chicago, so we thank you for spending this evening with us. And give it up for yourselves one time. There you go. Show yourself some love. All right, so now we're going to get into it, and I'm going to hand it off to our amazing executive director, Lisa Yoon Lee, who's going to give us an introduction and frame the conversation, as well as introduce our first presenter. So y'all give it up for Lisa. We're going to give it up a lot tonight, because I also want you to give it up to Tiff Beatty, our
extraordinary work organizing this, but also all of the MPHM staff, Lou, Mark, Sam, Colleen, Emily, and also let's hear it for Olivia, our ASL interpreter. I want to begin by recognizing that the region we now call Chicago is native land. This land has been cared for by many indigenous nations, including the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Sac, and the Fox, have also called this area home. Following the settler violence that culminated in the Black Hawk War of 1832 and the 1833 Treaty of Chicago, many indigenous people were forcibly removed from these territories or killed. Over a century later, under a different set of government policies called the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, many indigenous nations found themselves once again coerced to move, but this time back to the urban centers where their ancestors were originally dispossessed. Today, the place we call Chicago has the third largest urban Native population in the United States, with more than 65,000 Native Americans in the greater metropolitan area who continue to care for the land and waterways. Knowing where we live, love, work, and study does not change the past, but an understanding of the ongoing consequences of this past can empower us to create a better future for us all. Tonight's event brings us together around this book with a truly beautiful group of people. People who are cultural activists, scholars, researchers, artists, and organizers who have dedicated their lives to solidarity struggles. Their work shows us how solidarity work is about deep listening and learning from one another and the struggles of the most marginalized people. This work done carefully, filled with care, as opposed to carelessly, with less care, shows how true solidarity work is not simply about empathy for others, but rather the deep recognition that other people's struggles are part of our own struggle. In the words of June Jordan, there is no chance then that we will fall apart. There is no chance and there are no parts. The work that we'll be talking about tonight also shows us the importance of radical imagination, devoted to the creation of new forms of social life in new spaces and liberated zones. Everyone that you will hear from tonight is helping us chart a path to a different future and contributing to the imagination of social alternatives. This book so beautifully insists that solidarity work takes place joyfully in the terrain of design and creative culture, which is a crucial terrain of struggle. The National Public Housing Museum is particularly excited about tonight's event in this book because of the intersections of these issues with our mission as a cultural institution, as a site of conscience in the fight for housing as a human right. Always from our inception, working in solidarity with public housing residents. Our programs today include an oral history archive in the Beauty Turner Oral History School that is creating the largest collection of public housing resident stories and training the next generation of oral historians. The National Public Housing Museum Entrepreneurship Hub that is also building the Cornerstone Co-op that you heard about, a museum store owned and operated with public housing residents that is a cooperative that is learning from the historic solidarity economy. Our Artist as Instigator residency that Marisa Jahn now holds this year that connects art, culture, and public policy around housing issues, and through our many exhibits that are not only dedicated to telling the history of housing, but also our troubled relationship to the idea of the public, and what this book names as the common. Not the commons, but the common, a singular collective future for all of us, and for the practice of what the book names as mutualism. Although we continue to program throughout the city, and we're really happy to be here tonight at Haymarket, we are thrilled that the museum's permanent space in the historic Jane Addams Homes is currently under construction. It gives me such great pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Ai-jen Poo, who I first met at the U.S. Social Forum, where she was working with the National Domestic Workers Alliance to pass the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. Ai-jen is an award-winning organizer, an author, and a leading voice in women's movement. She is the president of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the executive director of Caring Across Generations, a senior advisor to Care in Action, the co-founder of Supermajority, and a trustee of the Ford Foundation. She is a nationally recognized expert on caregiving, the future of work, and what's at stake for women of color. She is also the author of the celebrated book, The Age of Dignity, Preparing for the Elder Boom and a Changing America, and a contributor of a beautiful essay about the work that makes all work possible in this book. Thank you so much for joining us, Ai-jen. Please join me in welcoming Ai-jen to the podium.
Hi, hello. So good to see all of you. Thank you so much, Lisa, and thanks to all of our hosts tonight. It's just, I'm so proud to be connected to this book and to be a part of tonight's event and to be in conversation with all of you. I'm actually going to kick us off by asking you to connect with each other for just 2 minutes. And this is how we start all of our meetings in the care movement. We ask everyone in the room to turn to the person sitting next to them and for 2 minutes share a story about someone who you've cared for or who's cared for you. And so maybe like 1.5 minutes each way, so you regroup in 3 minutes. So please share a story about someone who has cared for you or someone you have cared for. never been a room where the energy and the spirit hasn't just come alive as people are sharing their care stories. And sometimes the stories are hard, but people, there's just so much of our life force behind them. And it's so powerful how just there isn't a room that you could go in any place, any community in this country where people won't have their care stories to share. It just really does connect all of us in such a powerful way. And I wanted to start there because I usually start with talking about domestic workers, which is a very particular piece of the care story in this country. I have spent the last 25 years organizing with nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers. The women who work inside of our homes, doing the work that makes all of the work possible. The caregiving and the cleaning, the work for our families, the supportive infrastructure inside of our lives, our emotional lives, our family lives, our home lives, that makes it possible for us to go out and do what we do in the world, to work, to learn, to connect, to teach. And it's work that has always been done mostly by women. It's over 90% women who do this work, and majority women of color, including a huge concentration of immigrant women, particularly undocumented. So it's the part of the workforce with the largest density of undocumented workers of any part of our economy. And it's a job that, even though it's essential, and I think more people recognized in the pandemic just how essential it is, it's almost impossible to make ends meet doing this work. You are working incredibly hard, too many hours or not enough hours. You don't have job security or access to a safety net. Average wages are under $12 an hour. In the metropolises with the highest cost of living in this country. And 82% of all domestic workers went into the pandemic without a single paid sick day. And there's a lot of reasons for why that is. One of them is that this workforce has always been excluded from the time that our labor laws in this country were put into place as a part of the Great New Deal in the 1930s. Two groups of workers were excluded from New Deal labor laws, farm workers and domestic workers, because they were black at the time. And so it is a part of this country's legacy of slavery and anti-black racism that this workforce has been excluded literally for generations from basic rights that most of us take for granted as we go to work. The right to a day off, the right to Social Security had to be fought for and won by domestic workers who organized. And to this day, it's incredibly insecure work. And its insecurity has huge consequences, not just for the workers who do this work, but really for all of us. And that, I think, became even more clear and apparent in the pandemic. But we started to really think about it in about 2010, when a lot of domestic workers were coming to us and saying, hey, the family that I work for, I was hired as a nanny, but they're asking me to take care of the grandmother who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Or they were hired as a cleaner, but they were suddenly helping grandma who just got released from the hospital because she had a stroke and was recovering at home. And they were being called upon to take care of older adults, people who were ill, people who had disabilities, because what was happening was this kind of invisible but transformational demographic shift in this country, where thanks to advances in healthcare and technology, people are living longer than ever. And the baby boom generation, this huge generation, is aging into retirement at a rate of 10,000 people per day. So we basically added an entire generation onto our lifespan in this country. and not adapted a single thing about our policy, our culture, the design of our lives has not adapted to this whole new reality of an entire generation added onto our lifespan, including the need for care. And the most vulnerable workers in our care economy were being pulled into that gap, domestic workers. So we saw that, and we saw an opportunity to bring together the largest coalition in history, basically family caregivers, older people, people with disabilities, and all of their loved ones, and the workers in one gigantic movement to change the way that we value and support caregiving in this country. And figuring that out has been really challenging, as you can imagine, and we were greatly aided by this thing called COVID-19 that happened to all of us, where all of us suddenly were grappling with our own version of a care crisis. Kids home from school, struggling to figure out online learning, parents on lockdown in nursing homes or thousands of miles away without any support. And all of a sudden we realized that this thing that we thought was an individual responsibility, right? And if we couldn't figure it out or couldn't afford it, a personal failure, right? All of a sudden we realized that we as people are doing the very best we can, and it's not enough. We actually need infrastructure, we need policy, we need systems, we need a strong workforce of caring individuals like domestic workers to support us. We need it all. And suddenly there was like an opening, and we are still in that opening, trying to jump through. And that's why this book is so important, that's why tonight's conversation is so important, because these are fundamental questions about how we design our future to fundamentally account for our interdependence, our changing needs, our changing families, and the dynamics in our communities that are changing, and the fact that each of us needs and will provide care at some point and deserves equally support as we play that role or as we need that care. And so we've formed this coalition called Care Can't Wait that has been fighting for the federal government to invest in care in a transformational way. And we got a bill passed through Congress, through the House, not the Senate. We got a bill called the Build Back Better Act passed through the House that included $750 billion in investments in care. It would have been the largest single investment in the creation of good jobs that would directly benefit women and women of color in the history of the United States. Yeah. And these beautiful things started happening where groups that had been historically pitted against each other came together and worked together in lockstep. The disability rights and justice organizations that had historically not worked with unions and workers groups, we were all in lockstep coordinating on strategy, holding vigil, 24-hour vigils at the Capitol. And we refused to cede the ground that it had to be about both expanding access to services and care and good jobs for the workers who would provide those services, both and we would refuse the false choice of either or. And that got us to almost $1 trillion in investment. And it was proof of concept to us that when we organize and we build these connections, there is abundance in the values of mutualism and interdependence and care, not just because the ideas are powerful, but because we as people together are powerful. And the constituency behind care is the biggest constituency ever, because we're all touched by it, and I do believe that we could do anything together if we tried. And so that's what tonight's conversation is about. We're just getting started. Just because we didn't get a bill passed through the Senate and on the president's desk just means we, like, step one, and we're going for a step 2 and 3, and we're determined our movement is bigger and stronger and broader than it's ever been, and we hope that you will join us in getting us across the finish line.
One more time for Ai-jen Poo. And she'll be back for our conversation. But next, we have our 2 wonderful co-authors who are going to come up here and present as well. I'm very excited to introduce you all, if you don't know, to Marisa Morán Jahn. Marisa is currently the National Public Housing Museum's Artist as Instigator in Residence, which has just been such a joy over the last almost a year. Can't believe it. We've been working together, doing some really amazing work. So if you have not heard about the projects that Marisa's been working on, it's not in her bio, but you can check it out at the at the mphm.org. Some really great work that we would love to just share with you all. So Marisa is an artist of Ecuadorian and Chinese descent. Marisa's works redistribute power, exemplifying the possibilities of art as social justice. Co-designed with new immigrants and working families, Jahn's public artwork, civic media tools, installations, films, architectural and urban scale collaborations have engaged millions via the United Nations, Tribeca Film Festival, Obama's White House, and Venice Biennial of Architecture. She's a Sundance and Creative Capital grantee, a senior researcher at MIT, and the director of integrated design at Parsons at the New School. And we also have Rafi Segal, who Marisa introduced us to. So Rafi is leads an office engaged in architecture and urbanism as 2 inseparable preoccupations. This integrated approach to architecture and urbanism enables more impactful design projects that address the well-being of individuals and communities alike. Segal is Associate Professor of Architecture and Urbanism at the Massachusetts, MIT, we'll just say that, where he directs the urbanism program. He has a Master's of Science in Architecture and Urbanism. And of course, Marisa and Rafi co-authored Design and Solidarity, published by Columbia Press, and co-founded Care House, the U.S.'s first care-based co-housing project. You can learn more at carehouse.net. And please join me in welcoming Marisa and Rafi to the stage.
Good evening. I need this. Right. Let's see. Can I operate this?
Use the point over
Over here. Like that. Do you have another one? The side button? Side, yeah. Okay. We can start. Right. I think what we heard from Ai-jen in a way is sets as a designer, as an architect, the mindset of how I approach design and how I approach architecture. Aware of what our work. Oh, go back one. Thanks. Yeah. So, I want to talk about architecture as a form of social critique, and what I mean by that is that the architecture work or the design work has a potential in a way to establish a certain position. There are two ways that I would like to describe how that could happen. One is when, as we use our design skills to critique an existing reality by exposing it. And we usually use maps and certain drawings that kind of reveal that reality, and by that question certain issues of justice or power, etc. The other way is by creating another reality through built work, which is probably much more difficult. And that offers the way I would like to frame it, kind of an alternative to what we know. And that, in order for that to be successful, I believe it requires a dialogue of the designer, a dialogue between elements, a dialogue with people, a dialogue between the city and the building, between the object and its context, etc., etc. All elements that we use as architects. Next. So an example, a map that we made a few years ago of the world. Next. That basically you're all familiar with kind of this map, right? The typical territorial maps show a line dividing water and land. This map that we made said, okay, what if we just take the sovereign areas that nations control? Next. Right? And so Europe becomes like that, because according to international law, each nation state has 200 nautical miles of control into the water. So what they refer to as submerged lands. So a very simple operation, right, exposes an existing reality. Next. Space between the Americas. Next. Another project that involved in exposing a reality is a project that we call a civilian occupation, and it deals with the Israeli-Palestinian territorial conflict. This was a project, next, that began to map the different sovereign areas of Palestinians and Israelis, and began to read the urbanism and architecture of the conflict as a way to kind of execute kind of power by civilians over power of the Jewish settlements over the Palestinians. Next. And this involved drawing and drawing the different kinds of settlements, the act of urban planning, the act of architecture, how it kind of controls the landscape and supervises over the Palestinian population. Next. 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 And this was presented as an exhibition, as a book, as an exhibition. So this kind of explains maybe the first part of what I want to say, that we use design skills in order to expose that reality and bring a certain issue to the discourse, to the discussion. The other component, next, that also in the creation of buildings, designs, we relate back or understand that reality and relate to it and use design as a way to present a different alternative. This project for the National Library of Israel, the competition that I won, next, understood that reality in the context of Jerusalem, the reality of conflict, the reality of segregation, next. A city that is built on walls, or let's say vertical barriers, next, that are alive as they were thousands of years ago in their contemporary and changing form of continuous separation between its populations, next. So in the context of knowing a city that is structured around segregation and separation, the proposal here, next, it's going to be a lot of next here, was to create a design that would emphasize the horizontal movement that will eliminate barriers in its spaces, that would have an enormous amount of public accessible space. Next. Basically a plan, a floor plan, or maybe easier to see a section. I know it could be difficult to read a section, but this is kind of cutting through a building from your right to the left, a continuous space of changing courtyards that accommodate different kinds of publics throughout its entire plan. Next. So this kind of stepping continuation. Next. Of perhaps a kind of a topography, a merging of the building with the landscape, a series of open areas. You can walk on the roof, you can walk in the building, you can walk around the courtyard. Next. Next. And referencing obviously the landscape, but also reorganizing the concept of the library as a space that's always open, as a space that is for exhibition and cultural event, as a reading room, so a series of spaces that are accessible to the public. Next. So to have a building like this in a city like Jerusalem is really, in a way, unconceivable in a city that continuously closes, blocks, segregates, etc. Next. 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 Some of these ideas of a dialogue between a building and its landscape, for me, were developed in earlier work that I did with an architect, Zvi Hecker, in Tel Aviv for a history museum. Next. Where the site was an existing set of pine trees, and the building kind of wraps around and creates this kind of open, accessible public space in the middle. Next. So a series of walls, again, a landscape component that invites the visitors into their courtyard. Next. I should just stand there. Let me see some images. Next. Obviously, it's a military history museum, so there's reference kind of to kind of ruins and sort of military bunkers and such. Next. Next. Now this idea that we can intervene and propose a new idea or a new kind of building for a different way, let's say a different kind of library, a different kind of museum, or a different kind of housing, doesn't require that we necessarily build from scratch. It can also, and often it's easier to work with an existing structure. The reason for that, in large, is that our habits of living and some of the social structures that we change quicker than actually buildings can, or cities, which are very slow really to change. So in this project, we're giving an example in a way of Midtown New York. All the buildings in white are office buildings that have more than 30% vacancy in them. And this is quite typical, I bet you, probably in Chicago as well, that office buildings that were built for a single function, all office, 50 floors or more, now, probably more than ever, there's not so much need for them, right? So an existing building, yes, next. This one, designed in the 60s, occupies almost the entire block. For example, we took as that commission, this was commissioned by the Council for Housing in New York City, this project. Next. And the idea wouldn't be great just to imagine this huge vacant tower as a kind of urban block that kind of flipped vertically. Because, you know, the urban block in New York has such resilience, and it's kind of changing programs and activities. It has a variety of sizes, a variety of uses, right? Next. So that was kind of the general concept. And now we have an existing structure going again into the section of a building, because that's important. What can we do with an existing structure? Office towers usually have high floor to ceilings spaces, especially those that were built at a time when energy was free. So we took that section, next, and turned 2 office building floors into 3, next, residential floors, because residential kind of needs less, and so creating more space in the existing envelope Next. But then giving that space back in the form of open space, kind of garden. But what do you do with a garden that's just, on the 20th floor? Next. The question is also, well, how do you deal with a plan that's so deep? Housing units, residential can only go so deep into a floor. You need to get light and air and all that. Next. So another opportunity to add different kinds of programs in the kind of the thickness of the floor plan. Next. And then this, every floor becomes this kind of play of different programs, and that green component that kind of follows. Next. And kind of unfolding the building, and we're beginning to see the building, okay, rather than a single use, multiple uses in space, all connected. Next. And a kind of continuous kind of green space that spirals up into the tower, starts at the ground level, right, and kind of picks up pedestrians, and every floor has that access out to that green space. So in a way, next. One more. Next. Something that is already happening in many cities, right? Whether it's the High Line or whether it's other public spaces, that the city is actually becoming more pedestrianized. And there's an attempt to bring in more green into the city. So that way can we kind of pull it out vertically. Part of this project, the podium, which was larger, we kind of were playing around with this idea of the cabins, urban cabins. Someone picked this up, the journalist picked this up and said, oh, they want to do an urban kibbutz, yeah. Little did they know, next, that I was actually, next, working on a new version of the kibbutz. A kibbutz is a 20th century collective settlement type. We won't get into the whole politics of it, but it was very common in Israel about since the early 20th century, and more than 300 of these communities were established. They still exist, although they're going through this kind of process of transformation, but they're a great lesson on collective living, especially in their kind of more capitalist version, which is about a community that does make money and pay for their own homes. Next. The core idea was that obviously you separate different programs. Kids, are taken or treated, cared for together. It then allows more interaction between children and elders, naturally. Next. The adults work together and everyone kind of dines together. Next. And then there's also kind of that space for that living space with the kind of the cultural activities which take place. Next. What is interesting about this model is over time how the architecture kind of developed to support that, where the entire kind of settlement is your home. I mean, you would live here, but you would eat there, you would work there, you would kind of entertain yourself there, pool there, and usually kind of kids were all the way farthest away, right? Now, this model has gone through transformations. Next. But what was really beautiful to see that what creates privacy is the landscape through these pedestrian paths. And there is a redundancy of these paths because there's always another way. You don't want to see that same person again and again, right? There's always a way around. And so the subtlety in how you create next privacy, but still invite and kind of signal through the landscape these kind of different social conditions is also something that we're trying to kind of incorporate in our work. Next. One aspect here is a new neighborhood that we were asked to design. Next. Which builds off of these kind of pedestrian paths and lets it feed into an area where there's new housing. Next. And of course a study of the landscape. Next. That's organized around these clusters of 8 units that have a shared yard, shared storage, common room, etc. But the houses are individually paid for. Next. Shared solar system, etc. And the process here was really interesting. Next. Because we kind of, I don't know if you can see over here, right? it's kind of a cluster of 8 or 4, was kind of mimicked in the kindergarten where we had our session with people around, 4 families around the table, kind of designing the inside of their homes and kind of playing with the elements to get that right. So it's a good example of the architect creating, in a way, the hardware, I would say, of the design, and the occupants, the tenants, the residents, kind of filling in and playing with the parts and finding their own kind of place within that. Next. So these ideas, and I'm kind of taking you in different parts of the world in a quick 10 minutes, found their way also to Rwanda, to a project we did with a group at MIT, Next, where there's an interest to invest in villages, to modernize villages, and use some of the ideas of collective economy, living to scale up the villages, to bring infrastructure, to enable certain economies to flourish in the villages. Next. This is about a half-hour drive from Kigali in Rwanda, and the idea was to work, first of all, to help conceive of an overall plan as a model for these villages, but also develop a prototype house. Next. So similar to, in a way, to the kibbutz drawing that you saw, right? The center is public spine. It has various kinds of programs, health center, small market, nursery, etc., and the housing is organized around it. Next. And the housing is critical because much of the housing in Rwanda is made from mud, and with landslides, and it's a very topographical, hilly country. With the rainy season, it leaves so many people without homes. Next. And the efforts of the housing authority to create new housing was modeled on these, I don't even know how to call them, but like look at this plan over here. You see 4 houses with this kind of very narrow space, like in the densest kind of city. Right? We're talking about a rural village. And the bars and the brick was cheap, so we ended up using more mortar in between the brick, which makes the whole thing even more expensive. Right. Next. So we were trying to offer a different kind of house made from a different kind of brick with help of many, the Housing Authority, Rwanda University School of Architecture, a Swiss consultant firm that establishes local kiln to create these new bricks. Next. And we brought students from MIT, students from the University of Rwanda, mason builders, all to the site to teach everyone how to build a house with brick, but also to hire villagers who would then build the house for their future neighbors. Next. So the masons, you see them kind of in the jumpsuits, and the students learning how to use brick, how to build brick. Next. Next. And everyone around kind of figuring out what are we doing. Next. I'm trying to convince the head of the housing authority, if we have spaces between the brick we save, he's going to convince. Next. The students were experimenting with this. Next. Let's run this as a short video. Right, so time lapse that you see a lot of people not really doing much. So you see, it's not really progressing the house, right? But that's the point. The point, well, that the process, putting a layer of brick, taking a row out, putting it back in, debating, discussing, everyone is involved. Everyone is taking part in this. Everyone is engaged. And it created this, also these bonds with the villagers, obviously understand what they're doing. The discussion, the debate, everyone is learning from this. Eventually, next. Yeah, it doesn't go anywhere. it does get built, this house. It gets built, it's even cheaper, $1,000 in the other house you saw. And it does have components that respond better to the needs of villagers. One, for example, next, is this outdoor patio that can be closed and open and can act as a kind of shop, that you could sell stuff. You could use it as an open space, outdoor space. You can close it if you want for privacy. And it's on that street that you saw in the earlier plan, right? So it's a very incidental space. It responds to a certain kind of cultural custom as well of hosting and welcoming people. Next. And the kind of the porosity of the wall did eventually find its place, which is also this kind of relation of privacy and publicity. Next. And the house was given to a family who moved there. The backside, water collection. It has all the elements of kind of as much as you can. Yes, that's right. Next. Next. Right. I'll end here for now. Thank you.
So the book emerged from conversations that Rafi and I have had over the past few years in collaborating. And I'm going to share with you this exhibition at the Venice Biennale, which is informing the book directly. I think you have to run that video.
Design is a world constructing agency. We design the world and the world designs us back. Now, if what we have designed is so problematic, the question becomes, can design be reoriented? And I know we have to do the same things, and we have to create dwellings, but the challenge is how do we recreate those dwellings in a way that don't make us more isolated than we already are, but enable reconnections.
So historically, Black women have played a critical role in building the economic solidarity of their communities. We're really not just reacting against things, we're building spaces, activities, and connections for the long run, helping to build a community that extends beyond ourselves, and that is solidarity.
In order to create the common, that's something that's neither public nor private property, but is shared and collectively decided, that requires a design structure.
Building solidarity for workers means building spaces for our communities to flourish and express our values.
To Matt.
Okay, well, go ahead. So I say that I co-design public art and creative media with low-wage workers, new immigrant families, and women and children. And there's a few through lines through these groups of people, and one of these groups of people that I create work with, and one of them is immigration, and the other one is housing precarity or affordable housing, which is why I'm really excited to work this year with National Public Housing Museum, and some of the stuff is on the website, and there's more exciting updates to come. So the kinds of work that I do include, this is a set of pocket-sized comics to inform migrant workers from Mexico about their basic rights, produced with Centro de los Derechos del Migrante. this is a pocket-sized maps that unfold to inform New York City's 13,000 new immigrants about how to get access to the city's resources, and it's using the metaphor of birds because birds, New York City is actually an important stopover for birds. It's a green stopping where you kind of fill up. And some of the birds stay and some of the birds go, like immigrants who are enriching our urban ecosystem. And this is the Blue Bandido, which I co-designed with a group, with a community in Honduras, rural community, 12 years ago, and it's a public art and literacy movement that centers around a story-eating bandit who's so hungry for stories that he pesters little kids until they offer him stories that they've written. And he is bigger than Santa Claus in this part of Honduras, and the original kids who are involved in this project have taken it to different locations, and I've also brought it to other locations in North America as well, where the story gets rewritten and retold and inflected and redesigned anew. And throughout this work, and this is a theme in the book, and something that Rafi and I write in the introduction, is the way in which this idea of how can we surface and make visible the different economies in which we are already participating, care work, for example, being one of them. So this is a word that Rafi and I started using, pleroeconomies, to talk about that it's, oftentimes there's this fallacy that it's either capitalism or communism, but really there's many other ways. For example, when we're talking about the solidarity economy, there's many different ways in which we are already participating, and the many ways in which it's not only an economic transition, but communities and kinds of joy that we are reaffirming through those exchanges. And so the work that I do, as you were perhaps starting to see, works across scale from sometimes it's works on paper to installation. Throughout the work that I do, I'm really interested in using color and joy and humor because it dignifies the people with whom I work. This is an installation that Rafi and I did in the city of Mexico last year, which is created from wood recycled from Mexico City's first roller coaster. And it's a dialogue between the wood and the paper, which is it's called amate paper, which is a Mesoamerican and also Chinese tradition in which the holes of the perforated paper are said to let the past come through. So in this context, it was a celebration or commemoration of this period of massive socioeconomic transition in Mexico City, looking to the past to think about and reflect upon what do we carry forward to inform the future. And the thing I like about that project is that it was cited in Mexico City's first, the first public park in the Americas. And it's affirming the site and it's affirming the city fabric. And it was, moving on. So, okay, about Baby Bandido and also the roller coaster. I'm going to tell you a quick detour, which is we were talking with this policewoman who was patrolling this urban square at night. And we were explaining and giving context to this project, this pavilion, and when you tell people that it comes from recycled wood from the first roller coaster, a lot of people have very strong memories from childhood, and so she hugged the structure. So the roller coaster is really this larger-than-life character, in the way that Baby Bandido is like ignites people's imagination, and I really like that in the work that I do. And this is an alter ego of mine, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and copper, which is a way for me to talk about extraction and the disproportionate toll that our mineral dependencies place upon women and children in the global South. And so in this series of performances, I play the role of a grumpy goddess, and I pretend to break up with you as an audience because you've been abusing my abundance for the past 10,000 years. But I think that we have ways that we can patch things up. So one of the projects that I've been working on with NPHM is we were looking through the archives, and there's this really great, beautiful trove of these sculptures that were built in the 1930s. During this period, the WPA era, when public housing was first being built, and it was considered a reward. We were so lucky and so excited if you got to live in public housing because it was really well built and it was really well designed. And play and recreation were important parts of family life and just well-being in general. And so what I love about this moment is it contrasts to how many North Americans think about public housing. And sometimes for many North Americans, it's a pejorative, people think about urban blight, and this is really how things started to change in the 1960s onward when we began, this is the moment after suburbanization and white flight and this urban disinvestment. So what I like about these animal sculptures is that they are capturing play and joy, and which is how I experienced when I lived in public housing in New York City, that it was really diverse, and I just remember kids running up and down the hallways and in outdoor courtyards, and there's many people caring for each other's family members. I have been working on these illustrations for both coloring pages and what will be wallpaper inside the museum when it opens. And I've shifted the scale of the children to kind of capture the outsized role of these larger-than-life characters in the children's imagination. And I think what's so compelling to me about this period, Ai-jen mentioned that the 1930s and 40s is when most workers got their basic rights, but domestic workers and farm workers were excluded. This period is also really interesting to me. It is also, I'm interested in using the language and the aesthetics and the iconography from this period to kind of reroute it and think about how I would want it to be designed. And Michael Denning writes about how for artists, designers, and architects at this time, this was a massive cultural movement, and artists, cultural designers, and architects were proudly identifying as part of this movement and investing in the urban fabric. And so this is one of the sources of inspirations for the work that I do. And the other thing that's really interesting is that it was really dominated by second-generation immigrants. And as a second-generation Chinese Ecuadorian, for me, it makes me both proud and excited, and I think provides a different model than we have. So I started working with domestic workers 12 years ago, after the New York Bill of Rights was passed. And this video seems to be non-compliant. But it was also during this time when, shortly thereafter, I had given birth to my son, and was also thinking about and managing care for my grandmother, and looking ahead to how to care for my parents who don't have a safety net. And so I started working with domestic workers in New York City on a regional level and also on a national level. And throughout this project have created a number of different works from, let's see if the next slide video is compliant. I think actually you might have to. This is the Nanny Van, which is the mobile studio that I created to meet domestic workers where they're at. And I packed my son, and a filmmaker and organizers were with me, and we met up with many local groups along the way. And it was a way for me to manage my child as well as create different projects. And so, yeah, different things unfolded from this, this mobile vehicle. And when the nanny van died, she was born from 7 junkyards, we were looking for a new ride, and actually it was Ai-jen's team who called me up, and I was in my period of vehicular mourning, and they said, I think we have a new, we know you're looking for a new car idea, and we think we have one. What about the Care Force one? So I felt like such a title, and so we ran with it. So we're going to move on, and I'm going to see if I can bring up this. I think you did me a second.
This is little meets the road, right? We passed a law, but this is only the beginning. Now we have to do our work to really get out there and educate employers, educate workers about their rights, and we can do it.
I mean, creativity is really key to being able to reach people as well. So if you are just very grim and determined and you just talk about all the horrible things, no one wants to be a part of that, really. So you need to bring in creativity to address those really important, urgent issues, but do it in a way that really brings a lot of humanity to it.
Nadie va a dejar de espectacular, desde el color hasta todo lo que tiene muchos dibujos que se parece como la Mujer Maravilla, que eso somos nosotros, ¿verdad? Somos las Mujeres Maravillas.
You think you're alone in this world, right? You think that what you're experiencing is something unique and is only applied.
So, now I'm segueing in this part of the presentation towards a project that Rafi and I call Care House. And I started thinking about, well, what would it look like to shift how we value care on an urban and architectural scale? And if you think about the amazing, beautiful architecture that we have in the United States, it is usually cultural institutions, maybe hospitals or medical facilities, but it's not necessarily senior care. And how might that help shift how we value care? And I was thinking about, there's many different precedents that have informed our work, but I was really looking at, one thing that's really exciting for me is these 19th century material feminists and how they're innovating on a design, small level, on an architectural level, and also on an urban scale level. And it should be, so how can you share care and share housing? And those suffered a decisive blow under MacArthyism and the Red Scare, as well as later during suburbanization. So, so when we started investing in suburban areas. So, so when we think about where our government is investing in what kinds of infrastructure, whether it's care or housing affordability, and we think about this history of segregation and redlining, for example, and where we're investing, that, these are really twin histories, right? So, and when we're thinking about, Ai-jen was bringing up to speed in terms of the care crisis and the opportunities that it affords, right? So how can we think about and rethink about housing isolation and its toll on public health, this crisis in which 90% of Americans do not have savings, and the economic precarity of domestic workers, and how do we improve on the social determinants of health to rethink housing and care? And so I turned to Rafi. I was teaching at MIT at the time, and we met up with Ernst, and then kind of just go ahead and come up, and then we'll get us to Care House, which is a project that we're building with our third partner, Ernst Valery, who you'll meet in a second, which we say is the US's first care-based co-housing project in Baltimore, and so quality care in homes for older and disabled adults. adults, quality jobs and homes for caregivers, and centering them at the heart of the building, integrating arts and sustainable urban development. So the way that it works is that domestic workers are, caregivers are providing care, and there's, in our first building, there's units for 4 caregivers and their children. And older and or disabled adults are receiving care and paying into Care House. And everyone has their own independent units, but there's more shared space and different shared kind of programming amenities. Yeah.
Great. You're doing the science?
I am, so you tell me next.
So the building, I mean, it's really a project that is a full collaboration, not only in terms of the design, but also in how to make it work. There's so many aspects here: organizational, financial, programmatic, urban. The location in Baltimore is also significant. It's at the edge between what you see in purple is degrees of abandonment in the city, and it also reflects disinvested neighborhoods. Next. Where we are, at the corner of Greenmount and Prescott, is one of those few east-west connections that kind of stitch the city together, which is divided by north-south neighborhoods. Next. And so this idea of a corner, and thinking about an urban corner, and how can you maximize the effect that the building has through its location, but also how can we design something that is completely different than senior housing, or is completely uninstitutionalized. Next. Something that would not look like an old people's home in a way, nor place affordable housing for caregivers, right? Next. So a lot of effort into the design, large windows that look at the street, that engage the corner, retail on the corner. A lot of aspects of the design to make it much more appealing, but also to celebrate this kind of bringing together. And the plans were informed by 2 years of co-design sessions with caregivers, with elderly people, with doctors, nurses. The architecture is organized, that is in pink, as you will see through the floors of the 5-story building. The units are on the perimeter, and in the center there's a common space, no corridors. Each floor has a common space dedicated to a different kind of activity, which is shared by the caregivers and the others. And so the units are designed with all the considerations, materials are selected, and there's a lot of thinking into all the details.
And also, not only accessibility, universal design, but also for low vision.
And so you see that really what holds everything together is these shared common spaces that all have a terrace and all look into a courtyard. And now in terms of the art component, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I'm sure many of you have heard complaints about these very institutional and sterile senior care facilities, which is my nightmare. Many people, it's their nightmare. So how do you infuse that with art and design that also is honoring the people who helped create the project, and is historically specific and narrating parts of the history. So on the top left, you'll see some of the caregivers who were involved in co-design sessions. On the bottom, you see there's the symbol of the tulip, which is originated in Central Asia and then made its way over through textiles via the Silk Road to Europe and then to the New World, and it's a symbol of love. And the lioness came through conversations with Ernst, and when Ernst was talking about that's Bruce Lee, a different kind of solidarity. Clarice Castor, Ernst's mother, when he's describing her, he talks about that she would save money in her mattress to give microloans to other Haitian Americans, to making sandwiches for the Haitian American truck drivers, and she cleaned rooms at the Howard Johnson. She looked after her neighbors' kids, and she really embodied this idea of solidarity. So she's commemorated in these designs through the symbol of the lioness, which is usually a symbol of family pride, but we're extending to as a way of thinking about solidarity, extended family pride. And So, and this is Billie Holiday, who was a domestic worker, as was her mother, who's from that neighborhood. And that gets us to the end. Well, I guess just one final moment is this, this question that Rafi and I and Ernst have is, how do we scale this project? And it might not look like a care house, it would be contextually different. But we have really been going through policy. We wrote this white paper that was sponsored by MIT Washington, and it's really looking at what are low-hanging fruits that could inform and incentivize policymakers and the private market, private developers to create the strategy of what we call care-based co-housing. Because there's a lot of opportunities that we have to inform how we share care and housing that we really need to be solving. And this is one strategy. So that leads us to the panel.
Introductions short. I see some public programmers out there like, you guys are a little behind time. So we're gonna speed through these last two, but I want to make sure that we do welcome Iván Arenas, our moderator. Iván is Associate Director at the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. We're also former Senior Fellows for Chicago United for Equity. Dr. Iván. And also Ernst, who you heard a little bit about. Ernst Valery is the founder and president of FAA, Real Estate Investment Firm. So y'all bear with us. I think we have about 15, 20 minutes of conversation, and Iván's going to keep it quick and moving fast and very engaging. If you do have questions, again, we invite you to stay for the reception. We'd love for you to stay and hang out and mingle a little bit with folks. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, Iván.
Thank you very much. And so I'll make this fast and sort of more or less ask kind of one question for each of you, because I know there's a lot of things that are in this book. I really encourage everyone to pick it up. It's amazing. It had me thinking both as an artist, as an architect, as an organizer, in all those dimensions all at once. So I think, the essays in the book and Angelina's video, they really reinforce the point that design solidarity isn't just about the process of creating physical spaces, but also about narrative making, and that art and organizing are essential in that narrative making, as well as in creating the conditions for political empowerment. And so I think here, Marisa and Ai-jen, you have many years of organizing and creating art with care workers. I'm curious if you can speak a bit more about the role of art and organizing and narrative making and the role in political empowerment. And I'm thinking if you can maybe dig into that feedback loop between creative design, narrative making, policy shifts, how that builds solidarity, and how it gets us to public awareness, perhaps.
So as organizers, we think a lot about power. We believe that to change anything in the world, it requires shifts in power, and putting more power in the hands of more everyday people. And one of the things we think a lot about is that it's not just, usually when we think about power, we think about political power with a little p maybe, like the power to change policy and who makes it. But I also believe in something called narrative power. And cultural power, which is really about the power to shape how people think and feel about the world and a particular issue, a kind of work, a kind of job, part of the economy. And for us, we believe that there's kind of like two truths in the world. There's what's factually true, and then there's what's emotionally true. And they're not the same, but both really shape our behaviors and how we make meaning and the choices that we make. And to me, art and design is all about really embracing that we have very rich emotional lives as people, and that if we want to change how the world is, we actually have to change how people think and feel at a very deep, sometimes unconscious level about things. And art is one portal for us to do that, and especially when we can do it at scale. We work a lot with popular culture storytellers to reach audiences in the millions, but all of this is about building narrative and cultural power behind a world that's more caring.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, so one conversation that we've been cooking over, well, cooking in the book and also with Lisa talking about throughout the day is, and also with you, is the way in which art, design, and architecture are not, it's not the end, it's not the solution, it's really, for me, I feel like it's a very humbling way of knowing. It's not only an outcome, it's a interpretive process, and for me it's very important, I guess, in my life and work as one of the mechanisms in which we can change power, change narratives is through harnessing like visual, auditory, different kinds of imaginaries, and it's a way of pushing back what academics call the logocentrism, or like the dominance of the written word, which to me is a kind of a hubris. And so I think in my work I'm really interested in sensitizing us to the many ways of knowing, which is a way of also affirming the many kinds of knowledge, knowing and knowledge producing, and sharing of power and expertise.
Thank you, Marisa. Thank you, Ai-jen. And Rafi, I'm going to turn your way next. I think at the heart of design solidarity, there's this conscious unraveling of that binary between private and public, and in a way between the individual and society, kind of as if those binaries are kind of the only two options that we have. And Rafi, I know I'm thinking here of that video of all the folks creating a structure, putting it apart, bringing it back together to get to something new. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the features of that design solidarity. How do they resist those binaries between private and public? How do you harness that interconnected and interdependent character of our relationships to each other and to the world? Thinking of how you write about that flow between privacy to shared spaces to open and collective spaces that we see in your work.
You know, it's really difficult to talk about that in the context of architecture, because architecture, what we try to do, what we do as architects really is stabilize boundaries, stabilize, align the wall. We make walls. This is pretty clear divides between inside and outside, between private and public, right? That's kind of the task of architecture, in a way, the traditional kind of thinking of architecture. And the way that, maybe an analogy, is it also, in this society more than in others, this line between the private and the public, between what is mine and what is kind of theirs, right, is really critical, because let's say I walk outside on the sidewalk, right, and I trip, right? I need to know whose property I fell, right, to know who I can sue. So the liability of this mark has to be so precise. What is mine, what is private, and what is whatever the city's. But we're saying, in a way, through the book and through our work, can we explore spaces of, can we take that line, imagine that line, and turn it into a space, and talk about the ours, right? It's not like mine, theirs, there's an ours. There's another set of a gradient or a set of spaces that is not this or that. And I think that's a design challenge to begin to develop that concept.
Thank you, Rafi. Appreciate that. And I'm going to turn here to what we ended with, the Care House project, which you described here in presentations and also in the book as the first care-based housing project. It's engaging the care crisis and the housing crisis at once to create spatial practices that produce those conditions for dignified care, both for those being cared for and for those providing care. And I'm thinking here about this really interesting way in which it's bringing together an architect, bringing together an artist organizer, and a developer. And so Ernst, I'm curious, in a way, for you, why was it critical in a way to bring a real estate developer, an urban planner into that creative process? And for you especially, what was your role as you understood it? How was it different maybe from some of the other projects that you might get to work on as a developer?
So I think developers have like a really negative reputation, right? And you like immediately when you say the word developer, everyone, their skin crawls. And developers have earned that reputation because developers have, for the most part, been this really top-down thing, right? Donald Trump gets to be a developer, and whenever you think about that field, that's what you think about, right? Someone that's going to come in and say, I have all the money, or I have all the resources and the connections, and we go top down. And I think that's what we're trying to disrupt. And I say we, our company, and me individually as a person, we're trying to disrupt this old view of what a developer is, because these walls don't actually happen if there isn't a developer. So think of a built, project anywhere. It all took a developer, and yet we don't like developers. And so part of what happens with development that's happened for the last 53 years, let's say, if we want to be exact, is it's been this top-down thing, and it started with kind of urban flight. People left and went to the suburbs, and there was all sorts of negative, like redlining, and and we know what that created, right? It created like this real, like second class that was not invested in, right? And part of it is, who gets to develop? And when we do develop, what's that process look like? Who's part of that process? So, my background is not real estate development. No one really has real estate development as sort of their pedigree, right? So my background started out actually in architecture. I was an architectural apprentice. Then I got to school. I went to the best architecture school I could, go to. So I went to Cornell, and when I got there, the fact that I had been an apprentice didn't really help, because there it was about learning how to think completely differently, right? And it's like, I already knew what risers were and runs were, and so it was difficult to be an architect because I was really doing the art part. But what I loved was the people part. And so I discovered urban planning, and I became an urban planner. And what I found out about planning is you can have these great ideas, but they don't get executed. Planners work for politicians. And apologies to any politicians in here, but what tends to happen with politics is you can come up with this great plan, and the politician gets in a room with someone else, and whatever happens in that room, they come out and your plan is gone, and something completely dumb is going to happen. that they spend the next 20 years trying to fix. And so planners, all my friends who are planners get incredibly frustrated by that, right? And then, I thought, I'm going to get a master's in public policy, because I'm going to make policy, because we're going to make this change in the political realm. And then you realize policy takes 20 years to happen, and when it does happen, some dumb politician, or a smart one, is not going to enforce that policy. And so all these things that are in the books that should be happening, they don't happen. What I found was, real estate developers can actually get things done, right? There is no course of study for, I always say this in my class, there's no course of study, there is no oath that you take to be a real estate developer. Doctors do no harm. The lawyers, as scummy as we may think, apologies to any lawyers, lawyers have a bar association. There is continuing education. Developer, if you have money, if you have access, you can become a developer. So ultimately, this was, we met in the hallways at MIT. I had to go say hello to her mentor, and she was like, you should meet these folks. And I'm always game to think outside the box and to disrupt. And one of the things we're doing as a company right now is disrupting who gets to develop. We're saying most cities in America, most major cities, are majority women, and some cities like Baltimore, like Chicago, have, Baltimore is almost 70% black. right? Over 50 some odd percent women, 55% women. And when you look at the top developers in Baltimore, they're all one set of very connected, very rich white men. So that entire city that's a majority black, majority women, gets developed by a handful of white men. And so our thing is, development has to change. The approach has to change, and who gets developed, it has to change, and how we develop. It has to be in a collaborative way. It's crazy. We build walls, and then at the end we think about where does the art go. So one of the great things about this partnership is we started by, okay, where do the art's gonna go here, so what type of wall do we have to build to support that art, right? It's a completely backwards, but it's actually, the better way to think about a building. It's where is the art gonna go, where are the people gonna go? Let's start with that, and then let's design something about it that reflects the values of the majority of the people that are going to use that building. And so this partnership has been incredible because we're disrupting how things get developed, how things get designed. This had a process where we talked to the community. We had how many sessions? And we talked to the people that were going to be end users as opposed to this top-down. And that's what happens when you have diversity in development, when not just a traditional developer, because typically, and look, what we have now are these classic, places where we put people away, older people away, and that's developed by, the traditional developer. And so we're not the traditional developer. We're really trying to, disrupt how, buildings are built, but then let's also think about who gets to build these buildings. And at the end of the day, I think we have to think about how we invest in development as well, because it's so easy for the wrong actors, and I see Noah here who's an organizer, that the wrong actors get access to so much capital because, we believe in them, right? As much as we believe, Donald Trump's the wrong type of person to invest in, so many people have invested in him. They believe in that brand. The man has towers all over, and reputation didn't stop that because people thought, if I want to make a return, I have to invest. And even some of you, look at who, and if you have real estate in your portfolio, who is that money going to? I bet you it's going to Blackstone. And Blackstone is really destroying affordable housing right now, right? And then they put up commercials that make you think that they're doing the greatest thing alive, right? Oh my God, they are saving babies. But at the end of the day, their investments, it's slash and burn. They're looking for 2, 3, 4, 5x returns, and they're not thinking about people. And so we really have to think back and say, okay, it's great to be in a room like this and to be inspired by this kind of thought, but then who are you investing in? And I think development needs to be democratic. It needs to be led by people who have shown that they can make these kind of connections.
Thank you, Ernst. Appreciate it. We want to make some time for everybody to have a little bit of reception time and to get together, but I think one of the through lines within the book and kind of the presentations, even the responses here, is that design solidarity is really an invitation to do things with others, right? Whether it's architecture with others, organizing with others, developing with others, art with others, and that's not often, I think, as you mentioned, Rafi, that's not often the way we think about it and we're taught to do this kind of work. And so, I would say even my own work, and I think what's clear in the book, is that there are real insights and different ways of understanding and creating art, architecture, and organizing that come because of that, doing it with others, and not necessarily taking a top-down approach or imagining that you already have the solutions. And so I really invite everybody to pick up the book, to have more conversation with all the folks up here and with each other, right? I think with that, we'll end it for today, and thank you. Thank you so much.